Story 1.
My name is Sarah, and I've been a night shift nurse for 8 years. But nothing in my training prepared me for what I was about to discover in that empty room. Some patients leave more than just memories behind when they go. St. Mary's Hospital was a 200-bed facility on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and the night shift felt like a small, close-knit family. I'd chosen to work nights because the pace was different, less chaotic than days, more time to actually care for patients instead of just managing chaos. The 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift suited me perfectly, giving me quiet hours to do what I loved most about nursing, being there when people needed comfort in their darkest moments. Room 314 was in the cardiac wing, a corner room with large windows that offered a view of the hospital's memorial garden. During my 8 years, I'd cared for dozens of patients in that room, some who went home to their families, others who found peace in their final hours. It was a room that held both hope and sorrow, depending on the night and the circumstances that brought people there. The wing I worked typically housed 15 to 20 patients on any given night, mostly elderly folks with heart conditions, post-surgical patients, and those needing careful monitoring. My routine was well established: check vitals every 2 hours, dispense medications, update charts, and provide comfort to those who couldn't sleep. The familiarity of the routine was soothing, creating a rhythm that made even the longest nights manageable. But 3 nights ago, something had changed in room 314, and I was only beginning to understand what that meant. The last patient to occupy the room had been Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, an 87-year-old woman who'd been with us for 2 weeks following a mild heart attack. Mrs. Hartwell had been one of those patients who made the job worthwhile, kind, grateful, always asking about my family and sharing stories about her late husband. She'd been recovering well, her heart rhythm stable, her spirits high despite being far from home. We've developed the kind of bond that sometimes forms between nurse and patient during long, quiet nights when conversation flows as freely as the floor drips. On her last night with us, Mrs. Hartwell had been unusually restless. She kept asking me about the woman in white who'd been visiting her room, someone she claimed had been sitting in the corner chair, knitting quietly and humming old hymns. I checked the visitor logs. No one had signed in to see her that night. When I gently suggested it might have been a dream, she looked at me with such clarity and said, "Oh dear, she's not for me. She's waiting for someone else." Mrs. Hartwell was discharged the next morning to a rehabilitation facility closer to her daughter's home. Room 314 had been thoroughly cleaned and prepared for the next patient, but due to low census, it had remained empty. The monitors had been turned off, the beds stripped and remade, everything returned to that sterile, waiting state that empty hospital rooms possess. That's why the beeping I heard at 3:22 a.m. made no sense. I approached the door slowly, my heart rate increasing with each step. Hospital equipment doesn't turn itself on, and heart monitors don't run without a patient attached. As I pushed the door open wider, the beeping grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was causing it knew I was listening. The room looked exactly as it should: empty bed with crisp white sheets, visitor chair pushed neatly against the wall, flowers and get well cards gone. But the cardiac monitor was indeed on, its green line tracing a steady, normal heart rhythm across the screen. The pulse ox machine beside it showed readings of 98% oxygen saturation and a heart rate of 72 beats per minute, numbers that indicated a healthy, resting patient. A patient who wasn't there. I stood frozen in the doorway, watching those impossible vital signs scroll across the monitor. Every instinct told me to turn off the equipment and report the malfunction to maintenance, but something held me back. The rhythm on the screen wasn't random electrical noise. It was too consistent, too normal, too much like the heart pattern I'd monitored in hundreds of patients over the years. As I watched, transfixed by the steady green line, I noticed something else that made my breath catch. The rhythm displayed on the monitor was familiar, very familiar. It had the distinctive pattern of an elderly heart, with slight irregularities that I'd seen before. The same irregularities I'd monitored for 2 weeks in Mrs. Hartwell's heart rhythm. I checked the machine settings, thinking perhaps it was somehow playing back old data. But everything indicated it was reading current, real-time vital signs. The timestamp showed the correct date and time, and the readings were fluctuating naturally as a living person's would. Slight variations in heart rate, tiny changes in oxygen levels that reflected natural breathing patterns. That's when I saw her. Not clearly at first, just a suggestion of movement in my peripheral vision, a sense that someone had settled into the visitor chair in the corner. When I turned to look directly, there was nothing there, but the feeling of presence was overwhelming. The air in the room felt different somehow, warmer and filled with the faint scent of lavender, the same perfume Mrs. Hartwell had worn during her stay. I called down to the front desk, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is Sarah in 314. Are we expecting any admissions tonight?" "Negative," came the reply. "You're looking at an empty census until morning rounds." As I hung up the phone, the monitors continued their steady beeping, and I could swear I heard something else, the soft sound of knitting needles clicking together, barely audible beneath the electronic sounds of the medical equipment. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone to check Mrs. Hartwell's discharge information, needing to confirm what I was beginning to suspect. According to the records, Eleanor Hartwell had been transferred to Sunset Manor Rehabilitation Center at 10 a.m. that morning. But when I called the facility, the night supervisor's words made my blood run cold. "I'm sorry, but Mrs. Hartwell passed away this evening around 9 p.m. Natural causes. Her heart simply stopped." The pieces fell into place with startling clarity. Mrs. Hartwell had died at 9 p.m., and I'd first heard the monitors in room 314 at 3:22 a.m., exactly the time she used to wake up every night during her stay, asking for water and wanting to talk about her late husband. The woman in white she'd seen wasn't waiting for another patient after all. She'd been waiting for Eleanor. I understood now why the heart rhythm on the monitor looked so familiar. It wasn't just similar to Mrs. Hartwell's pattern. It was her pattern, captured somehow in the room where she'd spent her final conscious days. The monitors weren't malfunctioning. They were displaying the vital signs of someone who was visiting from beyond, someone who had come back to the place where she'd felt safe and cared for. Over the following nights, the phenomenon continued, but I was no longer afraid. Room 314 became a place of comfort rather than mystery. The monitors would activate around 3:22 a.m., showing those familiar vital signs, and I would sit in the hallway outside, listening to the gentle beeping that meant Mrs. Hartwell was making her nightly rounds. Sometimes I would speak softly to the empty room, updating her on the other patients, sharing small talk the way we used to during those quiet overnight hours. The monitor readings would shift slightly when I spoke, heart rate increasing just a touch, as if she were listening and responding the only way she could. Other nurses began to notice the anomaly, but most dismissed it as equipment problems. I never corrected them, understanding that some experiences are too personal and too profound to share with skeptics. Mrs. Hartwell's presence in room 314 became my secret, a connection that transcended the boundary between life and death. The phenomenon taught me something beautiful about the work we do as nurses. We don't just care for bodies, we create bonds that can outlast physical existence. Mrs. Hartwell had found peace in room 314, not just in her final days of life, but in the comfort and dignity she'd been given there. She was returning to the place where she'd felt most cared for, where someone had listened to her stories and held her hand during frightening moments. 3 months after Mrs. Hartwell's death, the nightly visits to room 314 began to change. The monitor activations became less frequent, the vital signs appearing for shorter periods. It was as if she was gradually finding peace, slowly letting go of her need to return to the place where she'd been comforted. The last time I detected her presence was on a quiet Tuesday night in February. The monitors activated at 3:22 a.m. as usual, but this time, the heart rhythm was different, slower, more peaceful, with longer pauses between beats. I sat in the visitor chair, the same chair where the woman in white had waited for her, and I spoke to the gentle presence I could feel in the room. "It's okay, Mrs. Hartwell," I said softly. "You don't have to keep coming back. We took good care of you here, and you can rest now. Your husband is waiting for you." The heart monitor showed one final, strong heartbeat, then flatlined, not in the frantic way that signals emergency, but in the peaceful way that speaks of completion. The screen went dark, and the room fell silent except for the distant sounds of the hospital continuing its endless cycle of care. That was 5 years ago, and I thought Mrs. Hartwell's story had ended that February night. But room 314 has taught me that some stories never truly end, they just take unexpected turns. Last month, a new patient was admitted to room 314, an elderly man named Frank whose family had given up hope after his third heart attack. He was frightened, alone, and convinced he was going to die in that unfamiliar room. On his second night, something remarkable happened. I was making my 3 a.m. rounds when I heard Frank talking to someone in his room. When I peered in, I saw him sitting up in bed, speaking animatedly to the visitor chair in the corner. The same chair where I'd seen that suggestion of presence so many times before. "She says you're the best nurse on this floor," Frank told me with a smile. "The lady in white. She says not to worry, that you'll take good care of me just like you took care of her." I felt a familiar warmth fill the room, and for just a moment, I could swear I smelled lavender. Frank recovered completely, and went home to his grandson 2 weeks later, crediting his healing to the angel nurse who visits room 314. Now I understand that Mrs. Hartwell's presence in that room was never about her inability to let go. She was preparing for something bigger, becoming the guardian angel she glimpsed during her own stay. The woman in white she'd seen wasn't waiting for her. They were both waiting to help future patients who would need comfort in their darkest hours. Room 314 isn't haunted, it's blessed. And sometimes, late at night when I pass by, I hear not one but 2 sets of soft footsteps, the quiet murmur of voices offering comfort, and the gentle sound of knitting needles clicking together as eternal guardians watch over those who need them most. The best part? Frank isn't the only patient who's mentioned seeing helpful visitors in room 314. There have been others, and I suspect there will be many more. Because some bonds don't end with death, they multiply, creating a network of caring spirits who understand that healing comes not just from medicine, but from the profound comfort of knowing you're not alone. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell taught me that the best nursing care comes from the heart, and hearts have memories that transcend physical existence. But she also taught me something even more beautiful, that love has the power to recruit others into service, creating an endless chain of compassion that reaches far beyond what we can see or measure.
Story 2.
The fluorescent lights above me buzzed like dying insects as I counted the register for the 3rd time that night. It was 2:47 a.m., and I was alone in Megamart, just me, the hum of refrigeration units, and the occasional crackle of the radio behind the customer service desk. I'd been working these graveyard shifts for 6 months, and I thought I knew every sound this place made after midnight. But what I heard that night would change everything I believed about being alone. The footsteps started soft at first, so quiet I almost convinced myself it was just the building settling. But buildings don't walk with purpose, and they certainly don't pause when you stop breathing to listen better. My name is Marcus, and I took the overnight cashier job at Megamart because nobody else wanted it. The pay was decent, the work was mindless, and most importantly, I rarely had to deal with customers after 1 a.m. It was supposed to be easy money: stock some shelves, clean the floors, and keep the store secure until the morning crew arrived at 6. What they didn't tell me during training was why the last 3 overnight cashiers had quit without notice. The store was one of those massive 24-hour supercenters that sprawled across what felt like several city blocks. During the day, it bustled with hundreds of shoppers, crying children, and the constant chatter of everyday life. But at night, it transformed into something entirely different, a cavernous tomb of consumerism where every shadow seemed to stretch longer than it should. The aisles that felt cramped during busy hours now felt endless, disappearing into darkness beyond the reach of the automatic sensors that controlled the lights. I developed a routine over those 6 months. Lock the main entrance at midnight, leaving only the side door for emergencies. Check the security cameras every 30 minutes. Walk the perimeter once every hour, making sure all the emergency exits were secure. It was during one of these walks that I first noticed something was wrong, though I didn't realize it at the time. It was a Tuesday night in October when I first heard them, footsteps that didn't belong to me. I was restocking the cereal aisle around 2 a.m. when I heard the unmistakable sound of shoes against linoleum coming from the direction of the electronics section. Tap, tap, tap. Deliberate, measured, like someone was taking their time, examining the merchandise. I called out, "Hello? Store's closed." But the footsteps stopped immediately, as if whoever was making them had frozen mid-step. The silence that followed was deafening, not the comfortable quiet of an empty building, but the tense stillness of someone holding their breath. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward electronics, my own footsteps echoing loudly in the vast space. The electronics section was empty. Every aisle, every corner, every hiding spot I could think of, nothing. The security cameras showed the same thing, empty corridors stretching into darkness. But I knew what I'd heard, and I knew the difference between the settling of a building and the purposeful movement of footsteps. As I stood there, scanning the shadows with my flashlight, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me from just beyond the reach of the light. I told myself it was my imagination, that working alone in a huge empty building was finally getting to me. But over the next few weeks, the footsteps became a regular occurrence. Always between 2 and 3 a.m. Always starting in a different section of the store. And always stopping the moment I acknowledged them. The pattern was unsettling, but what really started to unnerve me was how the footsteps seemed to be learning my routine. They would start in areas I'd already checked, as if someone was deliberately staying one step ahead of me. When I changed my patrol route, the footsteps adapted. When I tried to move quietly to catch whoever it was, they would start up in the opposite end of the store. It was like a game of cat and mouse, except I could never be sure which one I was. 3 weeks into what I'd started calling the footstep situation, I decided to do something I'd been avoiding. I reviewed the security footage from previous nights. What I found made my blood run cold, but not for the reason I expected. The cameras showed me walking through empty aisles, calling out to no one, chasing shadows that weren't there. But here's what made my hands shake as I watched the playback. On the audio, you could hear the footsteps too. Clear as day, captured on the security system's microphones, were the sounds I'd been hearing. Footsteps that had no visible source, echoing through aisles that the cameras showed were completely empty. It wasn't my imagination, and it wasn't the building settling. Something was walking through that store, something the cameras couldn't see. I called my supervisor, Dave, who'd worked at Megamart for 15 years. When I told him about the footsteps, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, he said, "Marcus, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Don't investigate those sounds anymore. Just do your job and ignore them." "What do you mean, ignore them?" "Dave, there's someone in the store." "No," he said quietly. "There isn't. Not someone alive, anyway." That's when Dave told me about Robert Chin, the overnight manager who died in the store 2 years before I was hired. Robert had been doing his final walkthrough when he suffered a massive heart attack in the electronics section. He wasn't found until the morning crew arrived, and by then, he'd been dead for hours. Dave said Robert had been obsessively dedicated to his job, walking the same patrol route every night for 12 years. Even after death, it seemed, some habits were hard to break. But Dave's revelation didn't explain everything. If Robert's spirit was just following his old routine, why did the footsteps seem to interact with me? Why did they stop when I called out, and why did they adapt to my changing patterns? The answer came to me during my shift the following Thursday. I was in the break room, trying to process what Dave had told me, when I heard the footsteps again. But this time, instead of calling out or investigating, I just sat still and listened. The footsteps moved through the store with purpose, following what I now recognized as a patrol route. They moved from electronics to sporting goods, then to pharmacy, then to grocery, the same pattern every night. That's when I realized something that chilled me to the bone. Robert wasn't trying to scare me. He was trying to help me do my job. I thought back to all the nights I'd heard the footsteps. They always started in sections I hadn't checked yet, as if guiding me toward areas that needed attention. When I changed my route, the footsteps adapted to complement my new pattern, making sure we covered the entire store between us. The stopping and starting wasn't evasive behavior, it was courtesy. Robert was pausing his patrol whenever I acknowledged his presence, waiting for me to continue my own rounds. The next night, I decided to test my theory. When I heard the footsteps start up in electronics, I said aloud, "Thanks, Robert. I'll check sporting goods." The footsteps paused, then continued, moving away from sporting goods and toward an area I hadn't planned to visit until later. It was as if he understood. From that night forward, we developed an unspoken partnership. Robert would patrol his sections, I would patrol mine, and together we kept the store secure. Sometimes, when I was running behind schedule, the footsteps would linger in an area until I caught up. Other times, they would move more quickly through sections that were clearly secure, helping me focus my attention where it was needed most. The fear I'd felt for weeks melted away, replaced by something I never expected to feel toward a ghost: gratitude. Here was a man so dedicated to his job that not even death could make him abandon his post. And instead of resenting the living person who'd taken his place, he was helping me succeed. I worked at Megamart for another year after that revelation, and Robert and I became an efficient team. Other employees would joke that I was the best overnight cashier they'd ever had, never missing a security issue or failing to complete my tasks. They didn't know about my invisible partner making sure nothing was overlooked. There were only 2 times when our routine was disrupted. The first was during a winter storm when the power went out and the emergency generators kicked in. That night, the footsteps were frantic, moving quickly through the store as if checking for damage. When I followed with my flashlight, I found a small leak in the roof that would have caused serious damage if left unattended until morning. The second time was my last night at Megamart. I'd gotten a better job offer and was finally leaving the graveyard shift behind. As I did my final walkthrough, I spoke to the empty aisles one last time. "Thanks for everything, Robert. Take care of whoever comes next." The footsteps that had become such a familiar part of my nights started up one final time, moving through the store in what I can only describe as a farewell patrol. They paused in every section we'd covered together, as if Robert was saying goodbye to our partnership. When they finally stopped, it was in the electronics section, the place where his story had ended and, in a way, begun again. I left Megamart that morning knowing I'd experienced something most people would never believe. I'd worked alongside a ghost, and instead of horror, I'd found respect, cooperation, and an odd sort of friendship. Robert Chin had been a dedicated employee in life, and death hadn't changed that dedication one bit. Sometimes, I wonder about the new overnight cashier at Megamart. I wonder if they've heard the footsteps yet, and whether they'll be brave enough to listen long enough to understand their meaning. I hope they are, because everyone deserves a partner as reliable as Robert Chin, even if that partner happens to be dead. The living aren't the only ones who take pride in their work, and sometimes the most dedicated employees are the ones who never truly clock out.
Story 3.
My name is David, and for 3 months, I was the only living soul in a 12-story monument to corporate failure. What I discovered during those long, dark hours would change everything I thought I knew about abandoned places and the memories they hold. The Meridian office complex had once been the crown jewel of downtown's business district, a sleek glass and steel tower that housed everything from law firms to marketing agencies. But the economic downturn hit hard, and one by one, the tenants moved out until only empty offices and broken dreams remained. The building's owners, drowning in debt, had finally given up and put the property into foreclosure. That's where I came in. Corporate Security Solutions needed someone to watch the building during the lengthy legal proceedings, making sure vandals didn't break in and squatters didn't set up camp. The pay was decent for what seemed like easy work: sit in the lobby, make hourly rounds, and keep the property secure until the banks figured out what to do with it. I'd worked security for 15 years, mostly at active office buildings and retail centers, so babysitting an empty tower felt like a vacation. The building had been stripped of most valuable items before I arrived: computers, furniture, anything worth stealing was long gone. What remained were the bones of a once thriving business hub: empty cubicles, bare walls marked with rectangular shadows where artwork once hung, and the lingering smell of old coffee and abandoned ambitions. The elevators still worked, the basic utilities were functioning, and emergency lighting provided enough illumination for my rounds. My routine was simple: arrive at 10 p.m., settle into the lobby security desk, and patrol each floor once every 2 hours. The building had 12 floors, each one more depressing than the last, filled with the ghostly remnants of corporate life. I'd brought books, a portable radio, and enough coffee to keep me awake until the day's shift security arrived at 6 a.m. But on my very first night, I noticed something that didn't fit the pattern of abandonment I'd expected to find. The 7th floor was different from the others in a way that made my security training kick into high alert. The 7th floor had housed Pinnacle Marketing, a mid-sized advertising agency that had been one of the last tenants to leave. Unlike the other floors, which had been completely gutted, this one still contained furniture, personal items, and half-finished projects scattered across desks as if everyone had simply walked out in the middle of their workday. Coffee cups sat on desks with rings of mold growing in them, computer monitors displayed screensavers that had been running for months, and motivational posters still clung to the walls with messages about success and teamwork. The first time I noticed the lights flicker, I assumed it was a problem with the building's emergency electrical system. Old buildings do strange things, and intermittent power issues aren't uncommon. But as I watched from the lobby that first night, I realized the pattern was too consistent, too purposeful to be random electrical failure. The lights would come on in the same sequence every time: reception desk first, then the 3 corner offices moving clockwise around the floor, and finally the large conference room at the north end of the hall. I made note of it in my security log but didn't think much more about it until the second night, when the same thing happened at exactly the same time. 11:47 p.m. Like clockwork, the 7th floor would come alive with light for exactly 12 minutes, then everything would go dark again. By the third night, I had to investigate. The elevator ride to the 7th floor felt longer than usual that night, the mechanical whirring echoing in the empty shaft like a countdown to something I wasn't prepared for. When the doors opened, I stepped into darkness. The lights I'd watched from below were off, the floor as black and still as all the others. But the air felt different here, charged with an energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. I used my flashlight to navigate through the maze of cubicles toward the area where I'd seen the lights activate. Everything looked normal, abandoned but undisturbed, exactly as it had been during my previous daytime inspections. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking through a space that had just moments before been full of activity. That's when I found the conference room, and everything changed. The conference room at the end of the 7th floor still contained its large oval table, 12 leather chairs, and a whiteboard covered with marketing strategies for a campaign that would never launch. But what stopped me cold was what I saw on the table. Fresh coffee in paper cups, still steaming, arranged around the table as if a meeting had just begun. The coffee hadn't been there during my afternoon walk through. I was certain of it. I approached the table slowly, my flashlight beam dancing across the impossible scene. The coffee was real, warm to the touch, with cream still swirling in some cups as if they'd just been stirred. Someone had been here, but the building was secure, my logs showed no entry, and I'd been watching the only entrance for hours. As I stood there trying to process what I was seeing, my radio crackled to life with a voice I didn't recognize. "Dave, conference room B is ready for the Morrison presentation. Can you bring up the quarterly reports?" The voice was professional, casual, as if addressing a colleague in a busy office. But my radio was set to the security channel, and there was no one else in the building. I grabbed my radio and responded. "Who is this? Identify yourself." Only silence answered back, followed by the soft hiss of static. I tried calling my dispatch center, but got only dead air. The radio was working. I could hear the background static, but no one was responding to my calls. That's when I heard the voices. Soft at first, like conversations happening just beyond the range of clear hearing. They seemed to be coming from different parts of the floor, the reception area, the corner offices, the cubicle maze I'd just walked through. Professional voices discussing deadlines, client meetings, project timelines. The kind of office chatter that forms the background soundtrack of corporate life. I followed the voices back through the floor, my flashlight cutting through darkness that now felt alive with invisible activity. In the reception area, I could hear a phone ringing and someone answering. "Pinnacle Marketing, how may I help you?" But there was no one there, no phone, no desk, just empty space where a receptionist had once worked. Moving toward the corner offices, I heard typewriter keys clicking, filing cabinets opening and closing, the low hum of conversations about marketing strategies and client presentations. The sounds were clear, distinct, impossible. And they were growing stronger. I realized I wasn't witnessing a haunting in the traditional sense. I was experiencing an echo, an imprint of intense human activity that had somehow been absorbed by the building itself. Pinnacle Marketing hadn't just abandoned their offices. They'd been forced out suddenly when their biggest client pulled a multi-million-dollar contract, leaving them unable to pay rent and forcing immediate closure. 53 employees had lost their jobs in a single day, their careers and dreams cut short without warning. The voices I was hearing weren't ghosts, they were memories. The building had recorded the final weeks of desperate activity as the company tried to save itself, the long hours and frantic energy of people fighting for their professional lives. Every late night, every emergency meeting, every moment of hope and despair had been imprinted into the very structure of the seventh floor. As I stood in the darkness, surrounded by the echoes of vanished workers, I began to understand the pattern. The lights flickered on at 11:47 p.m. because that's when the skeleton crew would arrive for their final push, the last-ditch effort to save the company that everyone knew was already dead. For 3 weeks, a dedicated team had worked through the night, desperately trying to salvage contracts and find new clients. The conference room meetings I was hearing had been their planning sessions, strategy meetings where they'd mapped out hopeless campaigns and impossible deadlines. The coffee I'd found was an echo of countless nights when exhausted employees had fueled themselves with caffeine and determination, refusing to give up even when logic said there was no point. But there was something else, something that made this more than just residual energy from past events. The building wasn't just replaying old memories, it was trying to complete unfinished business. In the corner office that had belonged to the company president, I found a presentation still loaded on an old computer that had somehow remained powered on. The screen showed the final slide of what looked like a revolutionary marketing campaign, one that might have saved the company if they'd had the chance to present it. The building was stuck in a loop, replaying those final desperate weeks, trying to finish what had been left undone. Every night, the phantom employees returned to their desks, working on projects that would never be completed, fighting battles that had already been lost. Over the following weeks, I developed a strange relationship with the seventh floor and its invisible occupants. I would arrive each night knowing that at 11:47 p.m., the building would come alive with the echoes of determination and desperation. Instead of being frightened, I found myself moved by the dedication of people who had refused to give up, even when their situation was hopeless. I started leaving the conference room coffee alone, understanding now that it represented more than just phantom activity. It was a symbol of the human spirit's refusal to surrender. The voices I heard weren't crying for help or expressing anger about their fate. They were working, planning, hoping against hope that their efforts might matter. One night, I made a decision that surprised even me. I sat down at the conference table with the phantom coffee, pulled out a notebook, and started writing down everything I could hear and see. If these people were stuck reliving their final weeks, perhaps documenting their efforts would give them the recognition they deserved. Maybe completion didn't require success. Maybe it just required acknowledgement. I spent hours that night taking notes on the marketing strategies I heard discussed, the client presentations that played out in empty offices, the creative campaigns that sparkled with innovation despite being born from desperation. The phantom workers seemed to sense my presence because the voices became clearer, more detailed, as if they were finally able to tell their story to someone who would listen. When morning came and the building fell silent again, I had filled 30 pages with notes about the most dedicated group of professionals I'd never actually met. Their final campaign, the one displayed on that lone computer screen, was actually brilliant. It represented everything they'd learned about their industry, every innovation they'd discovered while fighting for survival. I made copies of everything and sent them to the marketing trade publications, along with a story about the final weeks of Pinnacle Marketing and the incredible work they'd done while their world was collapsing. 3 magazines published articles about the Lost campaign and the dedication of employees who'd worked without pay to try to save their company. The seventh floor fell quiet after that. The lights stopped flickering at 11:47 p.m., the voices ceased their nightly planning sessions, and the conference room coffee disappeared for the last time. The building had finally found its peace, not through forgetting, but through being remembered. 6 months later, Meridian Office Complex was purchased by a group of investors who converted it into startup incubation space for young entrepreneurs. They kept one conference room exactly as I'd found it, turning it into a memorial for the Pinnacle marketing team. A plaque on the door reads, dedicated to those who never stop working, even when the lights go out. I still work security, but I've learned that empty buildings are never truly empty. They hold the dreams, hopes, and determination of everyone who ever worked within their walls. Sometimes those feelings are so strong that they refuse to be forgotten, creating echoes that demand to be heard by anyone willing to listen. The seventh floor taught me that the most important part of security work isn't protecting property, it's protecting memory. And sometimes, the best way to quiet restless spirits isn't with holy water or exorcisms, but with recognition, respect, and the simple act of bearing witness to stories that deserve to be told. In the end, Pinnacle Marketing got their final presentation after all. They just had to wait for an audience who understood that some work is too important to be interrupted by something as small as death.